After voting to unionize in 2018, Howard University professors have spent the past 4 years trying to negotiate their first contract. Just hours before lecturers and nearly 200 adjunct faculty members were set to strike earlier this week, the union secured a historic agreement with the university and called it off. Editor-in-chief of The Real News and host of the Working People's Podcast joins us to discuss. Welcome to you, Max.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So what's the story here? Tell us more about what's going on.
Yeah, well, I really, as always, appreciate you guys doing a segment on this because I think, it has gotten a fair amount of attention in the past few days. But for people there on the ground at Howard, right, this, as you mentioned, has been a 4-year slog to get to this first tentative agreement that, was reached at the 11th hour, just hours before adjunct professors and lecturers at Howard University were set to strike. They were set to strike at 9 a.m. on Wednesday, March 23rd. And I actually interviewed two folks from the bargaining unit, Dr. Aisha Bonner-Kazad and Dr. Sean Piers at Howard University, one an adjunct, one a lecturer. I interviewed them an hour before their final bargaining session, which began at 6 p.m. on Tuesday. And then I saw first thing in the morning that at 3:30 a.m. That bargaining team managed to finally reach a tentative agreement with the university and called off the strike. So that is great, and people kind of reported on that. But I think it's really necessary to sort of take the long view here, because what should be shocking to folks is first the reasons that these 150 full-time lecturers and around 200 adjunct professors at Howard University, one of the most storied higher ed institutions in the country, built after the Civil War, largely considered to be the most prestigious HBCU in the country, a school that has just a famous alumni list a mile long, right? And people there who teach there, who go there, they really care about the school and its mission, and the community there is something special. And yet, a lot of the folks who make that school what it is, who contribute to fulfilling that mission with their teaching and their advising, and the people who run the administrative staff, the nurses, so on and so forth, they have been struggling to get the university to pay them what they deserve, to give them the job security that they deserve. And this has been like what has been driving this long strike. When these lecturers and adjuncts voted to unionize in 2018, the average time it takes for a new union to reach a first contract with its employer is around 1.5 years, right? It varies depending on sector, but that's usually like the number that you hear. So for this to go on for almost 4 years, right, should really, tell you something about how serious the university administration was taking the demands of these workers who make the university what it is. But this is not, limited to Howard University. There are members of the News Guild in New York who have been struggling for the same amount of time to get their sorts of contracts. It is a union busting tactic that employers can use, because if you go long enough and you claim that you're bargaining in good faith, but you're actually not, and you go long enough without reaching a contract, you can declare an impasse, and the union will be forced to accept the employer's first offer of a contract before the negotiations reach that impasse.
And the overarching issue here, obviously, is that the pay is so kind of crushingly small that, if you factor in all the time spent grading and preparing, it can oftentimes for adjuncts be well below minimum wage even. But specifically, what were the issues that the union raised and that the union was negotiating over at the last minute? And what kind of concessions could you call wins at this 3:30 a.m. Agreement if it gets ratified?
Right. So, as you mentioned, the membership of SEIU Local 500, which represents these adjuncts and lecturers, and it also represents the nurses whom I mentioned. So the folks who have reached this tentative agreement will now be reviewing and voting on whether or not to ratify that contract in the coming weeks. So we're kind of in a wait and see mode, right? In situations like these, it really is important for the membership to kind of have a moment to look at this themselves, discuss amongst themselves without a bunch of like outside forces telling them whether or not this is a good deal. So unions typically don't reveal a whole lot of details about the TA until the membership has a chance to vote on it. But, as you mentioned, Ryan, the really big sticking points this entire time, there are a number of them, but there have been two that the folks that I've talked to have really emphasized, and that includes the folks I talked to for Working People. And yesterday, I was actually in D.C. for the Real News, and I spoke with Dr. Corey Lamont in the English department, and he mentioned this as well. One, like you said, is the pay. If folks have been living under a rock, which is understandable, maybe you haven't been on a college campus in a while, but there's a real big problem, a systemic problem that has been decades in the making. 4 decades ago, over 75% of the teaching work done at universities and colleges was done by tenure-track faculty who had the promise of higher pay, better benefits, tenure as a protection of their academic freedom, retirement, so on and so forth. In the past 40 years, that ratio has flipped. Now, over 75% of the teaching work at colleges and universities is done by what are called contingent faculty, which includes adjuncts, lecturers, and graduate students. People who are underpaid, people like adjuncts who basically don't know, they have to reapply for their jobs every quarter, every semester even. And so they don't know if they're going to be able to stay there and build roots there, even though they're contributing so much to these universities. Lecturers have a slightly better deal because they reapply every year to renew their contract. But again, one of the other sticking points for the union is that for folks in that position, there is this sort of arbitrary 7-year rule at Howard University where if you don't move up in your level of professorship after 7 years, you're basically fired, right? And so how can what faculty kept saying is, how can we build a robust community that students can identify with and carry on that legacy of Howard if we're just cycling bodies in and out of this institution and people can't build a life here and commit themselves to the institution? So pay to live in D.C., an incredibly expensive market to live in. There are teachers, professors at Howard who live in Virginia and Philadelphia because they can't afford D.C. So really making sure that folks, lecturers and adjuncts there, have the pay that they need to actually live, a moderately comfortable life in the city and devote themselves to their work was a huge thing. The other one was job security and kind of getting rid of this arbitrary 7-year rule. So we'll see what the tentative agreement, how much wiggle room was made on those demands. I think, as Corey Lamont told me yesterday for the Real News, he made a really important point. Even if we don't get everything that we want, the very fact that it took 4 years and a strike threat just to get the university to take us seriously, and they also filed an unfair labor practices charge against the university for bargaining in bad faith. So it took all that concerted action for the university to finally take these folks seriously. And so the fact that after 4 years they now have at least a tentative agreement and hopefully a first contract, that gives them a base to build on in the next bargaining unit, and they see themselves as part of a larger movement, a bottom-up movement at the university that includes the student protests against the housing conditions that we saw in 2021. And students were really an energizing force for the lecturers and adjuncts over this time. So it's a beautiful thing that I think means a lot for the Howard campus community.
I saw just a few days ago, there's a news story about UCLA put out an ad for an adjunct position that was going to be unpaid, totally unpaid.
Right. Get the exposure, you get to be a teacher.
Yeah, what a privilege to be unpaid. Wow. Max, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.